Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. A review by Louis Hillenbrand. Friedrich Nietzsche is a colossus in the history of modern Western philosophy, and his role in shaping contemporary thought is still echoed to this very day. His mindset is one of the most compelling and diverse in nature. This led various individuals and groups across the political spectrum of the 20th century to claim it as their own, from Soviet communists to German National Socialists and Italian fascists. Even if Nietzsche himself shunned politics, never took sides, and remained stateless for a great portion of his life. His was a thought that encompassed such varied observations, both amoral and encouraging, about the human being and what it should become, as to inspire many to follow parts of it, and only a few to follow it fully, and become true Nietzscheans. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born in Röcken, now part of Leipzig, in the Prussian province of Saxony, in 1844. He was the son of a Lutheran minister and former teacher who had worked for the state. His father died in 1849, and the family moved in with Nietzsche's maternal grandmother in Naumberg, and eventually in their own home in the same town. It was there that young Nietzsche began his schooling at the Domgymnasium in 1854. In 1858, he transferred to the famous Schulpforta, where, during his teens, he nurtured a passion for ancient languages, but also some obscure poets of his time, who eventually led him to discover the music of Richard Wagner, the most famous and controversial composer in Germany at the time. After graduating in September of 1864, he began studying theology and philology at the University of Bonn. The following year, however, he had a crisis of faith and opted for a more skeptical approach to religion, which deeply upset his religious family. The same year, in 1865, he discovered the work of German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer in his seminal work, The World as Will and Representation, in which he lays out that the world is but the stage for conflicting wills to be entangled in constant struggle. The reading of this book deeply influenced Nietzsche, and he considered it his awakening to philosophy. From that point on, he stopped studying theology and concentrated on philology until 1869 when, at age 24, thanks to the help of friends, he received an offer to become a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. To this day, Nietzsche remains one of the youngest individuals to have held such a title at such a young age. It was in Basel that he began frequenting Richard Wagner and his wife Cosima, the daughter of Franz Liszt, on a regular basis. The two helped him publish his first essays and protected him against criticism. Nietzsche also saw in Wagner a revival of the ancient Greek ethos of the tragedy, and, in 1872, after taking part in the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 1871, he published his first book titled The Birth of Tragedy. This was the beginning of a productive period of writing that saw his forging his independent thought and distancing himself from Wagner because of the composer's anti-Semitism and German nationalism. It was a productive period that lasted until his mental breakdown in 1889, that halted his activity until his death in 1900. One that saw the publication of some of the most influential works of Western philosophy ever written, including The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, and the work that interests us today in particular, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This work that was published in a serial between 1883 and 1891 is arguably Nietzsche's most accessible work. It also bears witness to the German philosopher's admiration for the ancient world, with its style that is reminiscent of ancient philosophical dialogues and texts. It is a very loose story focused on the character Zarathustra, named after the founder of Zoroastrianism, who, after spending some time in the wilderness, decides to teach men about his newly found philosophy. Throughout the work, Zarathustra explains through aphorisms and metaphors Nietzsche's main philosophical points, including the concepts of the will to power, the Ubermensch, and the eternal recurrence, on which we will be focusing in particular. It makes fascinating observations about human nature that were ahead of their time, and eventually even copied by the first psychoanalysts such as Sigmund Freud. It is a perfect introductory work to Nietzsche's thought, one that can be very inspiring even to this day. First, the will to power is the central piece of Nietzsche's philosophy. The will is what allows one to know, respect, and love oneself, and free oneself from slave mentalities. An interesting comparison that ought to be made is that while Nietzsche agreed with Schopenhauer's conception of the world as a stage for the battle of conflicting wills, he disagreed with his idea that to find any happiness was to renounce the world, perhaps even through death, which had a colossal impact on European artists of the 19th century, from Richard Wagner's Tristan und Isolde to the French symbolist painters and poets. Nietzsche rather celebrated this clash of wills and promoted that one should elevate one's will so that it may prevail and grant one what one desires in life. The opposite of dedicating oneself to one's personal will, according to him, is nihilism, or a desire to annihilate oneself entirely. This nihilism Nietzsche finds first and foremost in what he calls slave mentalities, the most obvious and prominent one being religion. Indeed, one of the early and key passages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and one of Nietzsche's most well-known quotes, is the famous God is dead, which encourages one to go beyond the arbitrary guilt-ridden doctrines of religion and define one's own doctrines come from one's will. In religion, Nietzsche saw a desire to surrender one's will and life itself, thus making one numb, and hoping for happiness in the afterlife, a true hatred of what life really is. What is interesting, however, is that Nietzsche's views on nihilism did not cover only followers of religions, but also those who, like many people in my generation, seek a life of uninterrupted pleasure. In fact, Nietzsche considered both Christianity and alcohol as the two narcotics of the European world. In one key passage that I thought was ahead of its time, Nietzsche writes, "All ye to whom rough labor is dear, and the rapid, new, and strange, ye put up with yourselves badly. Your diligence is flight, and the will to self-forgetfulness. If ye believed more in life, then would ye devote yourselves less to the momentary. But for waiting, ye have not enough of capacity in you, nor even for idling." To combat nihilism, Nietzsche proclaims the liberation of the will to always go beyond oneself, for life to surpass itself, and to achieve ever greater goals and ever greater development. This he describes beautifully in the following: "A blesser have I become, and a yea-sayer, and therefore strove I long, and was a striver, that I might one day get my hands free for blessing. This, however, is my blessing, to stand above everything as its own heaven, its round roof, its azure bell, and eternal security. And blessed is he who thus blesseth." Second, Nietzsche hopes through Zarathustra that this personal development cultivated through the embracing of one's will to power above all may lead one, if not to become it, to at least aspire to eventually give birth to the so-called Ubermensch, or the Overman. This concept is probably the most misinterpreted of all of Nietzsche's concepts. We know from history that it was stolen by both the Soviet Union and the Third Reich for the encouragement of the emergence of the new form of man in their respective totalitarian societies, namely the new Soviet man and the Aryan and Nordic master race. I myself found it difficult to define the concept. It was only when I came across this passage from Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, How One Becomes What One Is, that I could finally grasp what he meant. The word Ubermensch designates a type of supreme achievement, as opposed to modern men, good men, Christians, and other nihilists. When I whispered into the ears of some people that they were better off looking for a Cesare Borgia than a Parsifal, they did not believe their ears. If we can trust such a passage, it appears that the concept of the Ubermensch as a sovereign warrior ushering an artistic ethos is not one that can be embodied by everyone, obviously, especially in its amoral and multi-layered character that Nietzsche constantly promoted. Nietzsche himself, in spite of being considered insufferable, was nevertheless the composer of some very soothing chamber music, which puts into perspective what his idea of the Ubermensch could be. Since very few people can be fully Nietzschean, we can at least draw inspiration from the concept and from individuals in history who attempted to live by it, to achieve greater things in our lives. One such example, in my opinion, would be Gabriele D'Annunzio, an Italian writer and war hero who went as far as to carve his own Italian state in Fiume. He lived between 1863 and 1938 and, after establishing himself as a respectable literary figure, took part in the First World War in the Italian army. He became a heroic figure as he participated in the quasi-suicidal raid on the fortified harbor of Bacar, held by the Austrian Navy, and led the flight over Vienna to drop propaganda leaflets, some of which were written by his own hand, which partly said, "On the wind of victory that rises from freedom's rivers, we didn't come except for the joy of the daring. We didn't come except to prove what we could venture and do whenever we want, in an hour of our choice." Just like in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, we see a celebration of the will, of daring, and of venturing forward in life that is typical to the mindset of the Ubermensch. Those qualities of this mindset can definitely inspire one in one's struggle to attain the desire of one's will through both pleasant and difficult times. Third, as we said earlier, the Nietzschean will to power is not one solely focused on pleasure-seeking, but rather one that embraces life fully, in both its trials and revelries, for the fulfillment of one's will to be its ultimate homage. Nietzsche promoted the perception of the eternal recurrence to always remind one to enjoy every single moment of existence. The eternal recurrence is the mindset according to which one has to perceive every moment of one's life as being fated to repeat themselves forever. This idea forces one to take nothing for granted, and appreciate every ounce of pleasure and every difficulty that one finds on one's path towards actualizing oneself, accepting them as highlighting the joys of life even more. Difficulties then become enjoyable challenges to be overcome on the way to success, that make the path to it even more memorable. It is close to the ideas of the Greco-Roman Stoic philosophers such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who promoted that one should endeavor to fulfill one's role on earth, but also ultimately desire for things to unfold the way they must unfold, to inform that role. I myself have found in Stoicism a mindset that allows me to focus on that over which I have control, and accept whatever fate has in store for me, over which I have no control. This holistic acceptation of what life has in store for one, this Bejahung or yes-saying, is beautifully expressed in Nietzsche's own words from the collection of notes entitled The Will to Power. If we affirm one single moment, we thus affirm not only ourselves, but all existence. For nothing is self-sufficient, neither in us ourselves, nor in things. And if our soul has trembled with happiness, and sounded like a harp string just once, all eternity was needed to produce this one event. And in this single moment of affirmation, all eternity was called good, redeemed, justified, and affirmed. In conclusion, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a very accessible introduction to the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche that, in loyalty to the philosopher's spirit, can never be bound or fully defined, for definition is the first step towards the restriction of one's being, and the first step towards death, the antithesis of what life is about. In spite of its sometimes controversial nature, it is a thought that can still partly inspire us in achieving self-actualization through the attainment of the desire of one's will, and always overcome oneself to constantly surpass life, and accept the grand scheme of things of which we are a part, and what it has in store for us. Just like the subtitle of the work, A Book for Everyone and No One, suggests, Friedrich Nietzsche, like Zarathustra in the book, did not want to create a new religion for disciples to follow him blindly, but rather force us through his words to undergo a sober re-evaluation of our lives. His words have definitely had that impact on me, That is obviously the first step towards self-knowledge and self-respect, the first two necessary components that I have personally found to undertake the great adventure of the realization of one's total being, to become what one is, and achieve the bliss of being alive. A view immortalized 1,000 times over in the arts, including in Richard Strauss' symphonic poem Also sprach Zarathustra from 1896, that was used in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, an alluring dance for life to the music of the timeless and most inspiring words of Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to comment below to tell me your thoughts, give this video a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel for more content of the like. I wish you all a wonderful day and hope to hear from you soon.